The year is 1815. Across the muddy fields of Belgium, more than 200,000 soldiers are gathering for what will become one of history's most decisive battles. But before we talk about strategy or cavalry charges, let's discuss something far more basic. Something that every soldier, from the lowest private to the most decorated officer, thought about every single day. Food. What did these men actually eat? How did armies numbering in the tens of thousands feed themselves in an era before canned goods, before refrigeration, before military rations as we know them today? The answer might surprise you because feeding Napoleon's Grande Armée and Wellington's Allied forces was almost as complex as the battle itself. Let's step back in time and explore the real story of what filled the stomachs and fueled the bodies of soldiers during the Napoleonic Wars. Imagine you're responsible for feeding 70,000 men every single day in the middle of nowhere, with no grocery stores, no supply trucks, and no way to preserve food for more than a few days. This was the reality facing military commanders in 1815. An army, as the old saying goes, marches on its stomach. Napoleon himself understood this better than most. He once said that an army's effectiveness depends on its size, its training, its experience, and its internal organization, but above all, on its food supply. The logistics were staggering. A single soldier needed roughly 2 pounds of bread and 1 pound of meat per day, along with vegetables, salt, and something to drink. Multiply that by tens of thousands of men, add in the horses that needed fodder, and you have a supply operation that would dwarf most modern businesses. So how did they do it? The British Army under Wellington had a relatively organized system, at least by the standards of the time. They relied heavily on civilian contractors who would follow the army with wagons full of supplies. A British soldier's official daily ration was quite specific. 1 pound of bread or ship's biscuit, which was a hard, dry cracker that could last for months without spoiling. 1 pound of beef or pork. A third of a pint of peas or other vegetables. And a measure of rum or gin, because alcohol was considered essential for morale and, frankly, for making questionable water safe to drink. The bread often came in the form of those ship's biscuits we mentioned. Soldiers called them hardtack, and the name was appropriate. These things were baked until they were rock solid, designed to survive long journeys in supply wagons. To eat them, soldiers often had to soak them in water, tea, or soup first. And they frequently came with unwanted protein in the form of weevils, small insects that burrowed into the biscuits during storage. The standard practice? Tap the biscuit on the table first and see what crawled out. The meat ration was usually salted beef or pork, preserved in barrels. This preservation method involved packing the meat in enormous amounts of salt, which drew out the moisture and prevented spoilage. The downside? The meat was incredibly salty and tough. Soldiers had to soak it in water for hours before cooking, and even then, it was far from tender. When fresh meat was available, it was a cause for celebration. Cattle were sometimes driven along with the army, slaughtered as needed. But this was the exception rather than the rule, especially during active campaigns. Napoleon's army operated differently. The French had pioneered a system called foraging, which is a polite way of saying the soldiers took what they needed from the surrounding countryside. This system had advantages. French soldiers weren't tied to slow-moving supply convoys. They could move faster, strike harder, and weren't dependent on vulnerable supply lines that enemies could cut. But it also had serious drawbacks. For one thing, it meant that French soldiers often went hungry when passing through areas that had already been picked clean by their own army or by enemy forces. It also made the French extremely unpopular with local populations, who watched their livestock disappear, their grain stores emptied, and their vegetable gardens stripped bare. A French soldier's official ration was similar to the British one in theory: bread, meat, vegetables, and wine instead of rum. But in practice, what a French soldier actually ate depended entirely on where he was and what he could find. In good times, when foraging was productive, French soldiers might eat better than their British counterparts. Fresh bread from local bakeries, chickens from farmyards, vegetables straight from the garden. But in bad times, when the army was in barren territory, or when too many soldiers were competing for too few resources, French troops could go days with minimal food. Let's get specific. What would an ordinary soldier actually experience at mealtime in the days before Waterloo? Morning would typically start before dawn. If you were British, you might receive your ration of hardtack and a portion of salt pork. You'd probably have some tea if you were lucky, brewed in a tin cup over a small fire. The tea was important, not just for warmth and caffeine, but because boiling the water made it safer to drink. Soldiers didn't eat alone. They were organized into mess groups, usually 6 to 8 men who pooled their rations and cooked together. This made sense for several reasons. A group could take turns gathering firewood, standing watch, and cooking. They could also combine their individual rations to make something more palatable than each man eating alone. The main meal of the day came in the late afternoon or evening, after the day's marching or drilling was done. This is when the mess group would really get to work. If you had salt meat, you'd cut it into chunks and throw it into a pot with water. If you had vegetables, they'd go in too. Potatoes, onions, carrots, turnips, whatever was available. Peas were common, as they traveled well in dried form. The result was a stew or soup that bubbled away over the fire for an hour or more. Some soldiers carried small amounts of flour, which they could mix with water and a bit of salt to make a simple dough. This could be wrapped around a stick and cooked over the fire, creating a basic bread. Or it could be dropped into the stew as dumplings. Seasoning was minimal. Salt, of course, though the salt meat usually provided plenty of that. Sometimes pepper if a soldier had managed to acquire some. Herbs if you were camped somewhere they grew wild, and someone in your mess group knew which ones wouldn't poison you. The cooking equipment was basic. Most soldiers carried a tin cup, a plate or bowl, and eating utensils. Each mess group might have a larger pot for communal cooking. Everything had to be portable because the army could be ordered to move at any moment. Now, let's be honest about something. The reality of cooking in a military camp in 1815 was often chaotic and unpleasant. Firewood could be scarce, especially if the army had been camped in the same area for days. Soldiers might have to walk miles to find enough dry wood to cook their evening meal. And in wet weather, which was common in Belgium in June of 1815, getting a fire started at all could be a major challenge. Water was another constant concern. Rivers and streams near large army camps quickly became contaminated. Soldiers had to either travel far to find clean water or use what was available and hope that boiling it would be enough. Dysentery and other waterborne illnesses were common. The food itself was often in poor condition. Meat that had been in salt barrels for months could be rancid. Flour could be moldy. Vegetables, when available, might be old and tough. And there was always the problem of quantity. Official rations sounded adequate on paper, but in reality, soldiers often received less than they were supposed to, either because supplies were genuinely short, or because corruption in the supply chain meant that food disappeared before it reached the men who needed it. We should acknowledge that not everyone in these armies ate the same way. Officers, especially senior ones, had access to better food. They had personal servants who could shop in local markets. They had money to buy fresh provisions. They dined at tables with proper plates and silverware, not squatting around a campfire with a tin cup. A British colonel might sit down to roasted chicken, fresh bread, cheese, wine, and even dessert while his men were gnawing on hardtack and salt pork. A French general could enjoy a multi-course meal prepared by a personal cook, while the soldiers under his command made do with whatever they'd managed to forage that day. This inequality was simply accepted as the way things were. The class distinctions of civilian society carried over completely into military life. Cavalry and artillery units had unique food challenges because of their horses. A cavalry horse needed about 20 pounds of fodder per day. Hay, oats, grain, whatever was available. Multiply that by thousands of horses, and you can see the problem. In many campaigns, more logistics effort went into feeding the horses than feeding the men. This mattered at Waterloo. The heavy rain the night before the battle turned fields into mud, which affected the cavalry's ability to charge effectively. But it also meant that horses, already tired and underfed from the campaign, had to work even harder. Artillery units had similar challenges, plus the need to transport heavy cannons and ammunition. The men in these units often received the same rations as infantry, but their physical labor was sometimes even more demanding. We've talked about food, but what about beverages? For British soldiers, rum was a staple. The daily rum ration was something men looked forward to. It was distributed in the morning, often mixed with water in a mixture called grog. This served multiple purposes. It provided calories, it made questionable water safer to drink, and it boosted morale, especially in cold, wet conditions. French soldiers received wine instead, when it was available. Wine was considered a basic necessity in French culture, and the army tried to provide it even under difficult circumstances. Both armies drank enormous amounts of tea and coffee when they could get it. These beverages had the advantage of requiring boiled water, which made them safer than drinking from streams or wells near army camps. Beer was consumed when available, especially by British and German troops who were culturally accustomed to it. But beer was heavy to transport and difficult to preserve, so it was more common when armies were near towns or cities. In the specific days leading up to the Battle of Waterloo, food was a significant concern for both armies. The region around Waterloo was not particularly abundant in supplies. The armies were large, and they'd been campaigning for weeks. Local resources had already been strained. The weather didn't help. Heavy rain fell on June 17th, the night before the battle. Soldiers spent that night in wet fields, unable to light fires, unable to cook hot food, unable to dry their clothes or equipment. Many soldiers went into the Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815, having not eaten a proper meal in 24 hours or more. They were cold, wet, tired, and hungry. This mattered. Hunger affects decision-making, reduces physical stamina, and lowers morale. Soldiers fight better when they're well-fed. The armies at Waterloo were not well-fed. What about during the battle itself? Soldiers didn't stop being hungry just because they were fighting. But obviously, sitting down for a meal wasn't an option when cannons were firing and cavalry were charging. Some soldiers carried small amounts of food in their packs or pockets. A piece of hardtack, a chunk of cheese, some dried meat. Things they could eat quickly without preparation. There are accounts from Waterloo and other Napoleonic battles of soldiers eating during lulls in the fighting, grabbing a few bites between volleys, or taking a drink from their canteen when their unit was temporarily in reserve. But for the most part, the soldiers who fought at Waterloo on that June day were running on empty, fueled by adrenaline and discipline rather than by food. Once the fighting ended, the survivors faced a new challenge, finding food in the aftermath of a massive battle. The battlefield at Waterloo was littered with abandoned equipment, wounded and deceased soldiers, and destroyed supplies. The surrounding countryside had been picked over by both armies. Soldiers who could move searched for food, however they could find it. Supply wagons that had been held in reserve during the battle now came forward. But there wasn't enough for everyone, not immediately. In the days after Waterloo, as the armies sorted themselves out and began to deal with the aftermath, hunger remained a constant companion for many soldiers. It would be days before anything resembling normal food distribution could resume. Food in the Napoleonic Wars wasn't just about nutrition. It was about morale, about logistics, about the fundamental challenge of sustaining massive organizations of human beings under incredibly difficult conditions. The armies that fought at Waterloo represented the peak of Napoleonic-era military organization. But even these well-organized forces struggled with the basic task of keeping their soldiers fed. Soldiers improvised constantly. They learned which wild plants were edible. They became skilled at trading with civilians or with soldiers from other units. They developed techniques for making terrible food at least somewhat palatable. The experience of hunger was universal among Napoleonic soldiers, regardless of which army they served in or which country they came from. A British private and a French conscript might have been enemies on the battlefield, but they shared the common experience of going to sleep hungry, of eating food that was barely edible, of never quite having enough. So there you have it. The reality of what soldiers ate during the Napoleonic Wars, and specifically in the campaign that led to Waterloo. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't particularly nutritious by modern standards. It was often barely adequate, and sometimes not even that. But it kept armies in the field. It allowed men to march dozens of miles per day, to fight brutal battles, to endure conditions that would break most people today. The next time you read about the Battle of Waterloo, about Napoleon's tactics or Wellington's defensive positions, about the charge of the cavalry or the steadfastness of the infantry, remember this. All of it was accomplished by men who were probably hungry, who hadn't had a decent meal in days, who were making do with hardtack and salt pork and whatever else they could scrounge up. Food is the foundation that all military operations rest on. In 1815, as today, armies really do march on their stomachs. The soldiers at Waterloo proved that time and time again.